So here's a huge question. How does a legal framework that's centuries old, Islamic Sharia, supposed to work with a global economy that runs on totally different rules? Now, this isn't just some dusty academic debate. It's a real tension that millions of people feel every single day. Today, we're going to dive into one really powerful answer to that question. Okay, so here's our game plan for breaking this all down. First, we're going to lay out the core economic question everyone's wrestling with. Then, we'll dig into this super rigorous four-part framework for any kind of legal change. After that, we'll see how it applies to the massive test case of interest. And finally, we'll get to the author's final, pretty uncompromising verdict. All right, let's start with the big challenge here. Our world has been completely, and I mean completely, transformed by things like industry, global trade, and modern finance. The economic world of today looks nothing like it did in the 7th century. So the question becomes, how is a divine law, which is meant for all time, supposed to respond to this brand new reality? And that leads us to the core argument you hear from a more modernist point of view, right? They ask, look, given all these massive fundamental changes, doesn't it just make sense for Islamic law to adapt? Shouldn't it be reinterpreted to actually fit the way the modern global economy works? And this is where we see two totally different worlds collide. On one hand, you have the modernist view, which is all about pragmatism. It says Sharia has to evolve, it has to adapt to stay relevant in the world we actually live in. But the author we're looking at today offers a radical counterargument. He says, hold on, the purpose of God's law isn't to bend to a flawed human system, it's to give us the blueprint to fix that system. So, how does the author build this case? Well, he doesn't just reject change outright. Instead, he lays out a very specific methodology for it. Let's dig into the 4 conditions he says are absolutely mandatory for any legitimate reinterpretation of Islamic law. But first, let's make sure we've got our terms right. The process itself is called tajdeed, which means renewal. And the main tool for that is ijtihad, or legal reasoning. But, and this is so important, the author argues this isn't some creative free-for-all. It's a highly disciplined process that has to follow a very strict, established methodology to even be considered valid. So, according to the author, any valid reinterpretation has to pass 4 really tough tests. First up, it requires deep insight, basirat, into the very spirit of the law. Second, you have to truly grasp the lawgiver's ultimate objective, so you don't create loopholes. Third, any new reasoning has to stick to established legal principles, not just chase after the latest trends. And finally, and this is huge, you have to know the difference between what's fixed and what's flexible. If you don't have all 4, the author says any attempt at reform just doesn't count. And to make that first point really land, check out this powerful historical example. It shows the second caliph, Umar, actually suspending the punishment for theft when there was a famine. Now, he wasn't getting rid of the law. He just had that deep insight to understand its spirit. He realized the justice of that law assumes people aren't stealing just to survive. So the other 3 rules basically bolt this whole framework down. Understanding the lawgiver's goals stops people from playing clever legal games that follow the letter of the law but totally violate its spirit. Sticking to established principles makes sure that interpretations are actually rooted in the Islamic legal tradition, not just what's popular at the moment. And finally, knowing what's fixed versus what's flexible is critical. The author puts the prohibition of interest squarely in the category of mansus, something explicitly fixed by the text, and therefore not up for grabs. And that brings us to the ultimate test case, doesn't it? The whole issue of interest, also known as riba or sud. Let's see how the author takes his 4-part framework and applies it to this incredibly debated topic. Okay, so the main argument you'll hear from modernists almost always comes down to this one word, necessity. They ask, look, in a world where literally every financial system from your personal bank account to global trade is built on interest, isn't dealing with it just an unavoidable necessity if you want to survive and get ahead? And this right here is the core of the author's rebuttal. You see, the way we use the word necessity today and the strict legal definition in Islam, ittirar, are on different planets. In Islamic law, that term only applies to a desperate life-or-death situation. The classic example is you're allowed to eat pork only if the alternative is literally starving to death. It's an incredibly high bar to clear. So when you apply that super strict life-or-death definition, the author argues that all those modern necessities just kind of fall apart. Taking out an interest-based loan to buy a car or a nicer house, well, that's a desire, a want, not a life-or-death need. Needing money to start a business? The author points to legitimate, interest-free alternatives like profit and loss sharing or musharaka. And what about things like insurance or pensions that are tangled up in interest? The argument is that just because it's difficult doesn't make it permissible. It just means you have a duty to get creative and build your own alternatives. So after all that, where do we land? Well, we land at the author's final verdict, and it's not about finding a middle ground. It is a powerful call for conviction, not concession. And this quote it sums up the whole perspective perfectly. The author is basically saying that the argument, well, everybody's doing it, isn't a legal justification. It's just giving up. From this viewpoint, real scholarship doesn't just follow the crowd, it holds the line, especially when it's hard. And so the final verdict isn't a compromise at all. It's a full-blown call to action. The author is saying, stop trying to put Islamic bumper stickers on a capitalist car. The real ambitious project is to actually build a completely different economic system from the ground up, one based on Islamic principles like fairness, risk sharing, and a total ban on interest. And that, of course, leaves us with a huge lingering question. Beyond all the theory, what would it actually mean to build an economy on principles of faith in the world we live in today? And what would be the single biggest challenge you'd face trying to do it?